himself initially imagined. Now, that brings me to the topic of Prigozhin's latest comments. Now, please always remember that Prigozhin says many things. As I said, when he talks about capture of particular places, movement of forces in an area of which he has direct knowledge, then he is extremely reliable. When he talks about other things, he is often much less reliable. He was complaining, for example, about ammunition shortages. There was little sign that the operation in Bakhmut in its last days was seriously affected by ammunition shortages. He was worried about Ukrainian attacks on the flanks. Those attacks did take place, but they were repelled. He was worried that Bakhmut might be surrounded by the Ukrainian military. That never happened. He is a passionate, emotional man. He might have particular axes to grind with Russian military commanders. He is not always a reliable narrator of what happens over the course of the war, of any particular battle in the war. But nonetheless, he did say some very interesting things. He said that the total force, the Wagner force that was deployed in and around Bakhmut, numbered some 50,000 men. Now that, to me, probably sounds a bit exaggerated. He said that over the course of the entire fighting in Bakhmut, from the summer, the sort of midsummer of 2022 until its final capture, the Wagner forces suffered losses of 15,000 killed. However, of those 15,000 killed, only 5,000 were professional Wagner troops. And that's 5,000 out of 50,000 Wagner troops in total. That's a 10% kill rate. I would say that was extremely high, by the way. Higher than is generally acceptable in NATO armies, though not, it must be said, an impossible one. He also said that he recruited, over the course of the fighting, some 50,000 convicts from prisons. And he said that 20% of them were killed, which would be 10,000, and 20% of them were wounded, which would be another 10,000. An exceptionally high rate of loss. Now, that gives us a total figure, people killed, according to Prigozhin, on the Russian side in the Battle of Bakhmut, of 15,000. He says that Ukrainian losses in people killed were more than 3 times that number. So if we accept the numbers that Prigozhin is giving us, then Ukraine suffered losses of around 50,000 killed in the fighting in Bakhmut. Now, note that Prigozhin tells us that 10,000 soldiers, 10,000 of the Russian soldiers who were killed in the fighting were convicts. I have some doubts about this number, and I'll say straightforwardly why. It is exactly the same number that John Kirby gave for convict losses short time ago, about 10 days ago. He said, as I remember, that 10,000 Russian convicts were killed in the fighting in Bakhmut. Prigozhin says, has given us exactly the same number. That does make me wonder that perhaps Prigozhin is taking that figure from Kirby. Or it could be that Kirby was right. I don't know. But anyway, overall, Prigozhin wants us to think that 5,000 Russian professional soldiers were killed in the battle, as opposed to 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers, fully equipped, fully trained soldiers, regular army soldiers were killed in the battle. This is a horrendous rate of loss. Now, I am going to accept his figure of 5,000 for the losses that the Wagner organization has suffered. 5,000 professional soldiers killed. I think that his other figures, I report them because they're interesting, but I don't place particularly great reliance on them, either on the number of men that Ukraine lost, killed. He says 50,000. That's his number. But as I said, I don't place a huge amount of reliance upon it. And I don't place very much reliance on the number he gives of convicts who were killed either. Now, I will qualify that by making two observations. Firstly, it's now known that in the winter, January, February, the Russian authorities became extremely concerned at the fact that Prigozhin had apparently been granted, by no less a person than Putin himself, carte blanche to recruit convicts from Russian prisons, and that the number of convicts he was recruiting was perhaps greater than the Russian authorities anticipated, and he was told to stop. And I wonder whether perhaps one of the reasons he was told to stop was because so many of these people were being killed, and I wonder whether perhaps there was behind the scenes a big row about this between the Russian military, who weren't happy at the way in which these people were being thrown into the battle and were being killed, and Prigozhin, who always pushes back when criticism is made of him. And I wonder whether this is part of the backstory in the famous arguments we've had about ammunition, about Gerasimov and Shoigu and all the rest. So that's one thing I would say. And 50,000 killed Ukrainians. I don't know how many Ukrainians were killed, but I have seen figures of around 50,000 being floating around. And I know many people whose judgment on this I trust, who think that 50,000 killed in Bakhmut may actually be true. A devastating number of losses in a battle, in this particular battle. Now, Douglas MacGregor, Andrew Karibko, all sorts of people, again, coming back with this claim that Bakhmut itself is of no great strategic significance. Again, I'm going to push back on this. I can remember back in the summer and the early autumn when, on the contrary, there were lots of reports about the fact that Bakhmut was of great strategic significance. Bakhmut suddenly stopped being significant strategically when it started to become clear that Ukraine was losing the battle for Bakhmut. And again, to reiterate, it lies at the centre of a transport hub, the various railway lines that link up to Bakhmut. They have helped Ukraine up to now link together its various defence positions in Bakhmut. The fall of Bakhmut has deprived Ukraine of that ability. It's positioned the Russians where they can strike at various Ukrainian positions simultaneously if they choose. And of course, and perhaps most important of all, they make some of these railway systems now available for the Russians to use. If they can repair these railways, they can move troops and supplies right into the centre of the Donbass, positioning them in locations where they are now very close to the big cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, where the major last big Ukrainian defense line is left. So that's what I'm going to say about this. Prigozhin's comments, as I said, they're always interesting, but I've learned over the last few weeks that they cannot be relied upon fully. The Operation Bakhmut meat grinder thing has enough external corroboration, including from Surovikin himself, to be reliable. And as I said, Prigozhin is reliable about advances and occasionally retreats, but he is not reliable about tactics or strategy or supplies or about which troops are participating in a particular battle. And I don't think he's enormously reliable about losses either. But it has a